Well, we're, 4 or 5 days out from Election Day, and this, I would qualify it as feeling like a marathon. But those of you who are marathoners will know that there's a thing called the negative split. And what that means is that you finish harder and faster than you started. And certainly in this case, this campaign has not had any resemblance of finishing harder or faster with any level of energy or excitement that I think is going to engage people beyond what we have seen, because as we've said in the last few days, pretty much where we were 5 weeks ago. But we shall endure, and we'll want to finish this off. But I think there are some important things that we want to touch on. So Dave Trafford here with John Wright, per usual, and happy to welcome in Matt Gurney from the National Post. Matt, good of you to join us. Thanks.
Good to be here.
Couple of things. We were talking, over the last couple of days. Brett James was on with us yesterday, and it's funny, I guess he was one of our first guests on. And the things we talked about, Matt, and maybe day 6 or so of the campaign with Brett, we were talking about yesterday, and there was not a lot of needle movement, whether it was in the polls, whether it was in the attitudes of the campaigns, the postures of the campaigns. Yeah, sure, there's been a few wedge issues and minor stink bombs that have been dropped on there. But have you ever seen such a sort of a flatline campaign in your life?
No. I mean, that we can talk more about that, but that's the easy answer. No. It's funny because particularly on the polling side, which is always something I talk with John about, there was a lot of interest kind of over the weekend and early into this week about what looked like liberal movement. It looked like the Liberals had really blipped up a bit and the Conservatives had come down. It didn't make sense to me. And it's not that I'm betting against the Liberals. I couldn't see anything in the campaign on the ground that actually would have moved the national numbers like that. And then we start moving out those daily polls, and the gap narrows by 1%, and then it narrows by another percent, and then it narrows by another percent. And if you actually just looked at all these daily rolling polls, if you pick like a day of the week and you look at them, it's pretty much the same every day. Like, we've had a month of this. Nothing really interesting has happened. It's not like all along the way, right? There's been things that have come up, and there's been stories of the day. But one of the things I actually find remarkable about this, guys, is that, like, I joked at the start of the campaign, like, we were going to get a mug full of piss at some point, right? Like, I mean, there was going to be something that came up that really changed the narrative here. Did anything other than Afghanistan have any shelf life for more than maybe 4 days? I can't think of anything.
Well, what's shocking to me is first that Afghanistan, and I think still is an issue and a question for the government of the day, but that it came and went. But Matt, we all sort of, ripped our clothing and the gnashing of teeth and everything. And I do not say this to be disrespectful, but when the Truth and Reconciliation story really rose to the top back in May, people were feeling physically and emotionally wrecked over that story because of the realization, this level of national self-awareness that we were going through. Where is that?
It wasn't real in the first place. I always try to speak respectfully and candidly about these issues, because I know that these are live traumas for a lot of people. But what we went through when a lot of this stuff was coming out a couple of months ago, I think was a brief moment of shell shock as some Canadians collided with reality outside of their normal filter bubbles. And then we all retreated comfortably back into our filter bubbles here. And it sounds a terrible thing to say, but I've always been bearish on reconciliation, not because it doesn't matter or not because it's not important, but I think it's very, very hard to knock a Canadian out of their comfort zone. We always find our way back to it. So this was something that really, really bothered us for a few weeks. And I can't even tell you guys how many times in the last month or so I've had people, educated, informed, engaged people say to me, "Hey, why is the flag down? Did something happen?" I'm like, "No, they've been down since then." I was like, "Oh yeah, I remember that. It had just best summer ever," as the Albertans are maybe now regretting saying. We had a great summer. Everybody hit the barbecue and the golf circuit. It's like, oh yeah, what was that thing before? Completely vanished off the radar.
I think the only thing, though, that the flag has become, and the poll that Maru Public Opinion put out this morning showed that 78% of Canadians thought it was a good thing that it went down to half-mast, but 2/3 now say time's enough. The day after the federal holiday on Truth and Reconciliation, up it should go again. I think the flag has become a metaphor for the Conservatives to say, look, Mr. Trudeau does all kinds of symbolic things, but nothing gets done on the, down at ground level. I mean, whether it's boil water advisories or, housing or other things that are taking place in those communities, they don't get done. And the same when he comes out and he says, we're going to put a federal law in place so people can't surround hospitals and, block people's entrances, even though it does already exist in a municipality. And, we're going to deal with guns, which we've heard now for 6 years, which they haven't really done anything on that file. Like, you could go on and on and on. And that has emerged in the last few days as more of an amped up theme for both of the opposition leaders, that Justin Trudeau says something that is more symbolic than it is substantive. And I think that's a bit of a metaphor for what it's become. And it's no doubt it did connect more with young people and with women, and they still are the greatest groups to say keep it at half-mast. But I'm with you, Matt. I think that, it had an immediate impact, but it becomes more symbolic than substantive over a period of time.
Even though it was in many cases decades, even centuries ago, it was like being confronted by a sudden tragedy, and it really bums you out for a few days, and you sincerely feel terrible. But if you're not personally directed by it, after a week or so, you get back to your old routine. And I think I regret saying that because I wish this wasn't the case, but I got to call it as I see it. I think that's what happened.
What do you guys make of both the Liberals and the Conservatives, I'll say trotting out with all due respect, Jean Chrétien and Brian Mulroney? I watched Mulroney prior to the O'Toole event. I guess it was last night. And I got to tell you, I was enthralled. And I just sort of sat back and I thought, that's when politics was charming. And Chrétien is the same kind of guy. There's a certain charm about their presentation. There's a certain, I hate to use the phrase authenticity, but let's just use it because that's the local and the typical vernacular around it. There's a character there that we could point to and say, this wasn't a media trained voice. This was not something that was scripted, although you knew full well they were working off of points. But Brian Mulroney talking and storytelling off the top of his head. Chrétien has the same ability. And I thought, and again, don't want to kind of compare the eras, but it's just the nature of how far we have fallen in our own relationship with politics and politicians, Matt. I thought, I really kind of miss that. I mean, political stripe aside, I miss that.
Made me feel a little bit like how I felt in recent years looking at movies or TV shows kind of rebooting themselves and bringing back old characters. And it's like, oh yeah, I remember these guys back from like Politics season 4, and now we are in season 7, and the writers have really let things go a bit. I don't like the new characters at all. It's great to see these old throwback characters back in for a cameo in an episode. Well, I saw a little bit of Mr. Chrétien's comments, and he always had a good sense of humor. Like, as you say, whatever your political opinion of his aside, he was always entertaining to see in action. Brian Mulroney is 82. We don't see him much more in the public eye. He was obviously having an amazing time at that O'Toole event, which I got to watch. I liked it. It was nice to see. It does occur to me whether or not we should be taking octogenarians and putting them in enclosed indoor spaces during a viral pandemic. But you know what? Look, I mean, that's up to the campaigns. That's up to the guys. It was nice to see. But I think, Dave, other than kind of being, hey, look, there's the old war horses. I think my disgust with the current crop of politicians more than outweighs whatever nostalgia I might have for the old ones. So yeah, it was nice to see them, but it didn't take long for me to circle back to the distaste I feel for the present.
Yeah, John, I think it actually it sort of forced us to shine a light on what we've got. I said, damn, we had that. Now look at this recoil steamer that we have right in front of us now. How do we move this thing forward with any kind of sense of trust or continuity?
I don't think you do, because in the mid to later 1990s, politics changed, where evening sessions were done away with. The camaraderie of walking across those two sword links in the House were different then. And when we look at a campaign, the way it's being waged now and in the last 18 months, it's very personal. It's all about you, Justin Trudeau or Erin O'Toole. So there are knives pointed at each other that are right in front of you. I think that it said a couple of things. Number one, Mr. Mulroney's coming to give his oration in Quebec speaks to the fact that the Conservatives, when you take Mulroney and the Premier of Quebec, and all the campaign efforts that they're doing there, they think they have a chance of picking up some momentum and some seats. I mean, so that's what that play is all about. Mr. Chrétien, much of the same era, of course, is being wheeled out onto stage because the campaign is in trouble. That's it. I mean, there's two very big contrasts going on here. But I have to say, just as one point of reminiscence, I was one of the founders of the Woodrow Wilson Center Canadian Institute. So I got to go down to Washington many times and sit in really kind of cool settings. Saw Karzai from Afghanistan in a very small room. But there was, in fact, the anniversary of the free trade deal. And so in came President Bush, 41, and the President Selena from Mexico, and Brian Mulroney into a very small but very upper echelon group of people. So I'd say there's probably about 150 people in the room, and I'm sitting at the back. Oh my God, he had them in the palm of their hands. And it was not just the storytelling that we've all come to know him do, but it all seems so personable. And even though you've heard those jokes 100 times before, you still laughed at them just in the delivery of the lines. What you see in both of them are polished performers. They're great political icons. They do respect each other because they have nothing to lose, and it comes from that era. But they're great performers, and when they appear on stage that no matter what side of the aisle you come from, you're going to laugh when they say something. It is connecting with people. That's the difference. They're connecting with people and with political parties, whereas the others are not. I'd say Jagmeet Singh probably is more than the others during this campaign. But when it comes to Mr. Trudeau and Mr. O'Toole, it's more like they just connect with each other's party members and with nobody else.
Two things, though, that are sort of in the subtext of what Mulroney, for example, I thought Matt had to say. He pointed out that we were moving into an era where there was going to be a large transformation, that in fact we were talking about generational changes in this country, and that we needed real leadership, and that, Aaron O'Toole's the man to do it. I heard a lot of people say, holy cow, is that what we're voting for? And I thought, what the hell have you been paying attention to? Have you not seen what's gone on in the pandemic? If the pandemic has taught us nothing else, it's that we are going to have to face transformational, generational shifts in the way we run this country. So, I thought it was hilarious that it took Mulroney to kind of catch everybody's attention with that.
I've been calling this election in a couple of places a bit of a clip show election, which is that we could grab a bunch of news coverage from any of the last, say, 3 federal campaigns and splice the newscaster voice together, throw some B-roll behind it, and boom, you've got your 11 o'clock news, right? Like, it's on the campaign trail today. The Liberals attacked Conservatives over gun control. And, and in Winnipeg, the Conservative campaign denied that they'd be privatizing healthcare. You could cover this campaign using talking points from the last 3 or 4. And, the obvious exception to it is pandemic recovery, and I would even say pandemic management, right? Because we're not quite done with this thing yet. Other than that, though, this is a make-believe election where all of the leaders and all the campaigns are basically agreeing to share a delusion for a period of 5 weeks. And that delusion is that things are fine and that things are going to continue going as before. It was interesting late in the campaign when the Americans, the British, and the Australians announced this new defense pact they have. Canada didn't even come up. Well, of course not. Canada's still somewhere back around the year 2000, pretending that we're not in a geopolitical era of geopolitical upheaval, that we don't have a flattened economy. I wrote a column a few weeks ago. The overriding political assumption of my life has been Canadian federal fiscal capacity. That has underwritten everything, right? Like, because the hard work of the 1990s gave us room to maneuver on almost any issue. That's gone now. Like, we spent it all. And like, our politics is going to be different now. Never came up on the campaign trail because you know why? Because the answers suck and the leaders don't want to get dragged into being honest with the Canadian people about what the future is going to be like. So we pretend.
Yeah, and I think that sort of head in the sand kind of thing cuts both ways. I mean, it's easy to say that the politicians have taken us down that route. They are only reflecting what we as a country are going to with or be tolerant of. I mean, I think it makes the point, John, early on, we asked the question really about this election is what kind of Canada are we voting for?
Yeah, and we had that discussion a little bit yesterday about, when I said it's just divisive. It's completely divisive. And that is the nature of the politics of all of this. But let me draw attention to the banality of it all. And that is the public opinion polls at this stage of the campaign all start to narrow. And the reason they do is because everybody starts looking at each other's polls, but they also start laying in some other methodologies to go along with the kind that they've had. So, for instance, if you're doing an online poll, you might start adding a certain percentage of cell phones that you're going to call or laptops. I mean, it costs money for this. The media doesn't pay for it, so you're going to wait until the final days. So, where are we today? Forget about whether they're going to actually turn out. We're dead heat, like literally. I'm looking at the Wikipedia site is actually the best one because you just go there without any commentary and stuff. It's like federal Canadian polls during the election campaign. Look at it. 30.3 versus 31.9, 32.0 versus 30.2, 31.33, 31.8, 31.8. Oh my God. So who's the big loser in this? Justin Trudeau. Called an election campaign when there was an idea of an election campaign when he was at 48% of the vote. It dropped to 40. It dropped to 33. He's never recovered. And then on the other hand, Aaron O'Toole, it just seems like he's had this great momentum when in fact he had the other guy falling to earth and he's standing still. It may be that the NDP pick up a little bit and it's given this kind of birth to the PPC, and we don't know whether that's going to have some splitting effect in Ontario or a couple of other spots. But for all of the rancor, for all of the divisiveness, for all of the campaigning on wedge issues, where are we? And guess what? We're right back where we started from with a much more divided country. Because coming out of this is going to be a minority. The next big thing, I'd be interested in Matt talking to this, is when you come solo to a dance, and there's only a couple of people you can dance with in the room, then you got to choose, and hopefully they're going to like you to dance for the next 18 months. Let's assume for a moment that we end up with a minority circumstance, and then there's the NDP who's, batting their eyelashes on one side, and maybe the Bloc on the other side, eyeing what's going on with Mr. O'Toole in Quebec. And, I mean, the Greens nowhere. How does this all come together, especially when you've just raised, Matt, all of those important issues that are going to affect us for the next number of years with the reckoning of the pandemic? Like, how does this all come together? Even with Justin Trudeau, I don't know whether he's going to leave or not. I mean, if I were the leader, I'd think that I'd want to go home and, take a walk in the leaves instead of the snow like my dad did. But where does that leave us, on the day after the campaign?
These are great questions. I don't know. That's my lousy answer. I mean, whoever captures the upside of the margin of error swing is going to win. Probably a plurality, but they're so close that I don't know what's going to happen. I will say this to a couple of particular points. One of the things Dave was talking about it, and John, you were talking about it as well, the way that we had this big Liberal lead that just went back to nothing, right? What I think happened is that the moment the election was called, the Canadian public pulled themselves out of their pandemic mindset and went back to thinking as partisans. And I think the Liberals might have misread over the last year and a half sort of a sustained rally around the flag during an emergency as a structural shift in their favor of Justin Trudeau being charming and kind of winning over the Canadian people. Moment the election's called, boom, we just go right back to where we were in 2019. To your point, John, I would actually say the issue on that is going to be the exact shakeout of the seat counts. I don't know if Aaron O'Toole survives this. Like, if Aaron O'Toole doesn't bring back a narrative of some kind, either he's won, he sneaks out a majority somehow, he wins a strong minority, maybe he loses, but he gains 20 seats in the GTA. Like, if he doesn't have a victory narrative that he can sell to his own caucus, I think O'Toole's gone. And I think he's gone very, very quickly. you talk about what the next 18 months are going to look like. I don't know who's leading the Liberal Party 12 months from now. I don't know who's leading the Conservative Party 12 weeks from now. And all of that is going to shake out, right? You have to play ball. You have to be nice on the dance floor when you're in the middle of knifing your leader in the back.
Well, isn't that the sort of the heart of the whole problem here? Because when we talk about the Conservatives in the last election, they're all waving the flag saying we have the largest opposition in a minority government. I mean, seats, record, this is and that, and by all accounts on paper, Scheer should have been able to ride the horse into this campaign and be viewed as a prospective prime minister. But it's the Tories that killed him. It's not necessarily the Canadian voters. Similarly, it will be the Liberals who decide what happened to Trudeau, not the Canadian voter. And to your point, Matt, O'Toole is at the mercy of his own party. So the party system right now is killing us.
I would say this. This is the only good news Aaron O'Toole has. He's better than Andrew Scheer. I don't know if he's better enough. I don't know if it matters, but Andrew Scheer was sort of a bit of an awkward, bumbling leader who somehow found a way to underperform on the campaign trail. And I'm not even just talking about the revelations about his employment history and his being an American, which sort of caught us by surprise. I just mean in general, Conservatives have been telling us for a year, Aaron O'Toole will get out there and he will impress people. And that's what happened. During the campaign period, in general, his favorables have improved. His unfavorables are pretty stable. His do not knows are coming down and his favorables are going up. The more Canadians know him, they like him. Andrew Scheer had the opposite problem. So the Conservatives had to take Andrew Scheer out. Dave, you said they were all cheering about the size of their minority. Yeah, they were cheering really loudly so you didn't hear the sound of the single shot that ended Andrew Scheer's career, right? I don't know if Aaron O'Toole will do better than Scheer in the final vote. I do know, though, that O'Toole is out on a limb. He's out on a moderate, centrist, Eastern Canadian limb for a party whose their last 100 seats are a rock-solid, often rural Western Canadian base. If the Easterner can't deliver the bacon, I don't think he lasts long. So the only way he survives the next, like I said, 12 weeks is if he can show that his strategy is bringing the Conservatives closer to some kind of victory.
I agree entirely. And I think that, if you look at Quebec and if there's, if they're able to convert something there, it'll be new and he can hang on. I think that'll bode well. I want to date myself for a moment. I was actually an observer sitting in the third row on the right when Joe Clark came to the podium and said, I'm not going to run, I was actually in that room as an observer in Winnipeg when he came forward, and then there were people running for the doors, for all the campaign stuff. And it was different then in the sense that, Mr. Mulroney is of a different era. Mr. Davis was of a different era, that sort of thing. For maybe a different reason, and that is campaigns were constructed not as kind of micro campaigns. They were bigger campaigns. You had Blue Thunder and the Big Blue Machine operating for Mulroney, but they had a very big campaign across the country, and they didn't have social media. They didn't have the kind of tools that we have today. And I look back in American politics and I mark Karl Rove as being the instigator of dividing the audiences. I mean, he said, there's no right-wing media. We got to have one, and then regretting it years later because of what it did. But I wonder sometimes whether or not what we're dealing with right now and why we're stuck at 33-33, why we're not getting that big picture, why we're not having the Chrétien-Mulroney years again, is because of the micro battles that are going on. I mean, we're fighting over a handful of seats. There's nothing that we can actually see in the media above, in television and radio, we're getting a little bit. But the knife fight, as aptly described by a number of people in the campaign trails, are going on Facebook. And they're all very micromanaged. They're all very personal at that level. Again, I come back to this. I'm not sure what we get when we come out of this. I don't know who you're going to end up with. But I hasten to say, though, that unless there's a change of leaders one way or the other, we may end up back at the same place in 18 to 20 months because the style of the campaign remains the same. The only difference was Justin Trudeau started this campaign with no ballot question and no real reason for doing it. So what he did was he plucked all the negative things of the other candidate and said, hey, I'm better than him. And that's basically the campaign in a nutshell. I would hope that the Canadian public is better served if we have to go to the polls again in giving us something that's better than just the other guy is crap and I'm better than him.
Guys, I'll just jump in just for a second. John, the one thing I would mention, and Dave, you'll probably have thoughts on this too, is we actually, if you step back and take a historical view, and you take a long view on this, we actually are looking at something interesting happening in our politics, where I would have said when I was growing up, liberals would sort of have an automatic 5 to 10% national lead, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like they had to screw up badly and the conservatives needed to catch a lot of breaks and run a really good campaign to be equal with the liberals and, hey, maybe even win the odd election. What we're actually looking at now is a long-term, I would say a slow rise in rock-based conservative support in this country and a not dramatic but steady erosion in rock liberal support in this country. I would say we're a country now where core identified liberals and conservatives are about equal. And that might be why our politics are getting weird and why we keep having minority after minority after minority. I don't know if we have fully thought about this yet or necessarily even recognize that this is happening, but I don't know if we have a natural governing party anymore. We seem to have a country with a bunch of Tories, roughly as many liberals, and some NDP guys desperately trying to get someone to notice them.
Agreed, but I mean, again, touching on what I said yesterday, I mean, if Aaron O'Toole becomes the leader of the country and he's got hands on money or whatever he wants to do, I suspect because he needs to invest in certain voting areas that he'll actually recognize things to do in Quebec. Okay, so like he'll give them daycare, he'll spend some time there, stuff like that. Justin Trudeau spent no time in Alberta. I mean, it would have been lucky if his plane even entered the airspace. If anything, he bought the pipeline and then said, I bought it, but you can't use it. It's kind of like, you didn't vote for me, so you get nothing. So there and everything was where, all the grants and all that stuff were being made in places where his voters were. I think if Aaron O'Toole is put into a place, he's by necessity going to have to do more for all of the regions of the country in order to get where you were just talking about. I mean, if anything, if you have a left of center Tory as opposed to a right winger who just simply says, well, we got to get Alberta back in the game and we've got to do this, in certain areas of the country. If Aaron O'Toole gets some investment in Quebec, he's going to do something there and he's going to do something in other parts of the country, which in fact may make it so that we start to get some kind of national party back again that's running the country. Mr. Trudeau's had a lot of chance to do that over the last 6 years. I just haven't seen it.
But isn't that opportunity sort of reflected in the comments? Again, I go back to the Mulroney appearance yesterday, and he really underlined the nature of the Progressive Conservative Party of Canada. And that, in fact, you both have described that tendency. We may have we broaden the conservative base, not because we're more conservative, but we have determined that we have conservative values, but still have a progressive value about us. And I think I talked to a young volunteer who's working in southwestern Ontario, one of the ridings down there, Matt, and they were all just thrilled to have her because she's, 30-something. But she said, okay, but I'm here and I have certain views on abortion. I have certain views on same-sex marriage, and I have certain and they were having a hard time listening to her from that point of view. She's a progressive, small p, conservative. And I'm hearing that conversation come up more and more.
What I think we've been seeing over the last few years, Dave, is that the Conservative Party has been buying in for sort of cheap Twitter engagement purposes, kinds of American-style politics. I hate using that term in the Canadian context because I think that's lazy. But we're only ever about 5 or 10 years behind the curve from America, right? And starting about 5 years ago, the Trump phenomena, whatever you want to call it, came up, and all the institutional safeguards a lot of us assumed would exist in the Republican Party crumbled. There weren't any. Trump ate the Republican Party like an hors d'oeuvre, and it's still his. I think for the conservatives, I think a lot of young conservatives in particular don't care about the culture war battles of 20 years ago, right? Like, I mean, abortion, gay marriage, guns, two-tier healthcare, these are not the issues of the 30-something generation who can't buy a house, know their infrastructure is crumbling, and hey, the planet seems to be getting warmer. And, if you are someone who still sees value in fiscal prudence and individual rights and a smaller government in scope or in size, you got to put your vote somewhere, and that's not the Liberals. The Liberals in this foundational era for the political lives of the 30s, even the early 40s, the Liberals have been courting the left. And they've been doing it reasonably effectively, right? But there's nowhere for someone, say, between 25 and 40 who's right wing, even slightly, to go. So there is an unhappy marriage right now within the Conservative Party, which is kind of why we were talking about a few minutes ago. I don't know if O'Toole survives long. The Conservative Party is a big tent. Maybe it's too big. And I don't know if it's going to work. I think, though, to the point of the young person showing up, the biggest problem I think O'Toole has in winning in Eastern Canada are the dumb comments and bad tweets the party puts out to reassure the more hard right flank of the base. Don't worry, we're still your guys. I don't know how the Conservatives can ever win a big majority government again while keeping the fringe happy and also appealing to the middle. Except, of course, the time-honored way of Conservatives winning governments, which is to wait for the Liberals to kill themselves.
You know what? I have 7 favorite words that I use for people when they've been hitting their head against the wall, it seems, for a long time in politics. How's it working for you so far? I mean, if you look at the issues that have blown apart the Conservative campaign to potential voters to join them, they're all the things that the fringe, in fact, are talking about. I mean, yes, you got a gun lobby involved. It's not a mainstream issue. You know what? In the old days, you might have said, let's campaign from the left and rule from the right. Or in some way, let's make sure that when we get into power, we can activate changes, as opposed to simply putting them on the table before we do. And that speaks to a tomfoolery kind of campaigning. It's disingenuous in the sense that, hey, this is what we voted for and this is what we're getting, which is different when they're governing. But for goodness sake, if you look over the last century, tell me how many times the Conservatives have actually ruled the country versus the Liberals. Well, it's right in front, and it's always the same things. It comes down to exactly as you said, Matt. Any good communications person would have gone through that platform book a week before and yellow tabbed about 5 pages and said, better be ready for this or we should rip the page out. And they weren't there. And they're all the issues which come up all the times that sink the Conservatives. And you kind of go, again, I'll use my 7 words. How's it working for you so far? And I'm glad you finished there.
I'm glad you finished with banging your head against the wall, because that's kind of how I feel after the last 5 weeks. And, of course, you know, Red Skelton used to say the beauty of banging your head against the wall is it feels good when you stop. We will stop on Monday. Matt Gurney, thanks for joining us. It's been a pleasure to have your insights today.
Thanks, guys.
All right, he's John Wright. I'm Dave Trafford. It's the Rit Race, and this is an Eye Contact podcast.